people and an introduction for others. So there are three things that we need to be very clear about before we can practice properly. The first one is, what does the Buddha mean by right awareness? The second is, how do we deal with those mental states that drag us away? And exactly what are we supposed to be investigating? And then hopefully to give you two metaphors which help us understand the process we're going through. So in order to understand right awareness, we can recall the life of the Buddha himself, his experience. So remember, he left home with what we would consider an existential crisis. It's put in a mythological way that one day he saw a sick person, a very old person, and a corpse, and an ascetic sitting under a tree. And what this said to him was that sickness, aging, and death is coming, and maybe there's an escape. Some people wake up to the fact that there's sickness and death even when they're children. But most people, I think, wake up round about the age of 25 to 30. Just as youth comes to an end and you're looking ahead to the wonders of middle age. For some people, it doesn't happen, the Buddha says, until they're dying. So it's good to realize these things early on. So the horror of the time was continuous rebirth, one after another, an inability to escape this continuous rebirth, reincarnation. And remember, you could be reborn as any being in the cosmic, in the cosmos. So there was a movement at the time which began before the Buddha by people who wanted to see whether there was an escape. And there were many people who thought that actually life was fate. You were given a life and there was no escape from it. And some were materialists. When you die, that's it. So when he entered into the area of ascetic practice, there were many teachers and many ideas. And the pressure, the mental pressure for him to seek some sort of answer to his existential crisis forced him to leave his family. The fact that he left his family when his child was born tells you how much he was disturbed. I give it a positive twist. Other people think it's terrible that he left his family. People don't leave their families without good reason, usually. And he didn't leave her destitute. It was an extended family. So the first thing that he tries is what we call now the jhana, absorptions. So his first teacher taught him how to go through the various levels of these absorptions. Okay. And he was so good that he was invited to be a co-teacher. And yet it had not really answered his deeper problem. Because when he was in a state of absorption, then he was in heaven. It was wonderful. But when he came out of the absorption, he found himself to be anxious and depressed. So he then tried another teacher who sent him just a little bit higher on these absorptions. And again, he was invited to be a teacher, and again, he really didn't think this was answering his deeper problem. So this is one particular method that was highly developed at the time of the Buddha. And it was told by the teachers that this is the best you can expect. The other system was to do with self-mortification. The understanding was that the body was an expression of your bad karma. So for instance, hunger was really created by your tongue. And that somehow if you could get rid of the body and shed it as a karmic consequence, your soul would rise into a permanent heavenly state. And this was the teaching of the Jain leader. And it was also, yes, and Jaina.
Janista.
Janista. And it was also, in his understanding, bad karma even to kill something when you didn't mean to do so. So maybe you've seen the Jain monks always sweeping in front of them, so they don't stand on any ants. So the idea was to slowly starve the body and let go of it. And in fact, this is still done by Jains, especially elderly Jains. So he tried that, but eventually he abandoned that practice. He said he got so thin he could hold his spine through his stomach. So if you try that, you'll see he was very thin. So he said it was just more suffering. And so he abandoned that practice, and his 5 companions, he was with 5 other ascetics, thought that he had gone soft. And then we have a picture of him sitting by the roadside, and a woman walks past with some food for the local god, for the shrine of the local god, something sweet, a cake. And seeing this poor wretch, she thought, maybe I should offer him some food. So he took the food, and at some point or other he had a kernel memory.
Ricordo.
Yes, it's good to note that right at the point of what can only be understood as real despair. He's tried this teacher, tried that teacher, he's getting nowhere. He doesn't see a future. And at that moment, a woman comes to offer him food. So women have a kernel role in the process of liberation. And then he has this memory.
Un ricordo.
Yes, he's watching, as a child, he's watching his father doing an opening ceremony to the ploughing season, to begin. And he remembers as a child being completely absorbed. But there was something different from the absorptions that he had been practicing. So whereas with the absorptions he just wanted to create very beautiful mental states, what was driving his absorption as he watched his father was an intense curiosity. And this is my own interpretation, you understand, as a famous scholar, that his whole process turned around upon itself. Whereas before he's trying to escape suffering, now he turns upon himself to ask, how does he create suffering in the first place? And it's with this sort of new inspiration that he seeks a beautiful spot near a village. Not too close to the village to be disturbed by them, not too far so that he couldn't go and get some food. And he made for himself a little grass sitting place, nice and soft. And with this new inspiration, he began to investigate himself. So here we have an image of right awareness. So consider the young child, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7, before the intellect becomes awake. So I'm sure you've seen how a child that sees a spider for the first time is just absorbed into observing. The eyes become fixed. They lose contact with the outside world and their jaw drops. So from our more heightened understanding, they look gormless.
They look
gormless, do you know this?
Gormless. Gobless. Gobless.
No. Gormless, come si dice? Ecco, così.
Ok, sono rimbambiti. Rimbambiti.
So the parent usually wakes them up. In which case they ruin all possibility of enlightenment at that moment. So as the child absorbs, when it has enough information, it stops and it turns to mummy or daddy and says, what is it? And the parent says, oh, it's a spider. So now the child has a perception, spider, and he has a label, spider. So now the next time the child sees a spider, he doesn't look at the spider. He rejoices that he has been able to put a label on it and say, "Ooh, that's a spider."
È un ragno.
And the parent rejoices, "Very good." Again, increasing the delusion of the poor child. So this is where we are. Whenever we see something, we see it from some historical concept. You cannot look at this bell without positioning it with all the bells that you've seen. Everything that we see has to fit into a concept that we already have. And without realizing it, the concept we have is distorting our perception of what we're looking at. So when an artist looks at a tree, what they're doing is really looking at the individuality of that tree. And that's what we have to do. We have to go back to that original childlike way of looking at things. And we do that by stopping the thinking process and putting our attention directly into our sense bases. So if we can have that image of a child looking at something for the first time, it gives us an idea of the sort of awareness we're trying to develop. So now we have to be clear about what stops us from achieving that. And these are the habits that we've developed in our lives. And these habits have tremendous emotional force. So we know them as either something which is unwholesome, anger, anxiety, etc. Unwholesome, unpleasant, unpleasant. And all those pleasant ones, around eating, sex, drugs and rock and roll. So there is this connection, this way of being in the world which is driven by our emotional lives. Of course, there are positive mental states. Love, compassion, joy, gratitude and so on. But even these can be corrupted by our misunderstandings, by wrong intentions. So when we're sitting, so we're now into the practice, when we're sitting, whatever the heart begins to offer, that has to be really experienced as it is. The emotion will want to express itself, in fact indulge itself through the mind. Hence the mind begins to make up stories. Now when we realize that these stories are actually developing the mental state, then we see they're actually doing us harm. I mean, we know that if you're angry in the morning with something, if you keep thinking about it during the lunch break and in the evening, by the time you go to bed, you're furious. So with all these emotional mental states that arise, our work is to come off the thinking mind. And we come into the body to feel them as sensations, feelings. So it's the same technique all the time, to actually experience emotion as a feeling, as an experience in the body. And it's by sinking into that feeling that the heart can now release that bad energy. So you may find that when you actually do that, the emotional state becomes even worse. You thought you were angry, but then when you open up to your heart, you really are angry. Sometimes it may come up so fast that it frightens you, in which case you can stop the meditation. Perhaps you take a little walk, and then you take a deep breath and go back into it. Because this is the therapy. And so with the hindrances, they're known as hindrances. This is the same technique, except one other technique, with one other hindrance, which is dullness and lethargy. So now those mental states to do with desire and aversion, just the restlessness, guilt, shame, remorse and doubt, skeptical doubt. All these are like whirlwinds. But this quality of dullness and lethargy is like a whirlpool. It wants to drag you down into oblivion. And oblivion is wonderful. There's no suffering in oblivion. So when we feel that happening, we know that at some point the oblivion comes to an end and we resurface into a bad feeling. All these, that state is as important as anxiety and depression. And it's something that we really have to work with and overcome. And how do we overcome it?
Right.
We stay awake, we open our eyes, you can stand up, but you again have to sink into the feeling. And it's only then that the heart can purify itself. So the turbulence in the heart can only purify itself when it comes into consciousness. Otherwise it remains locked in the psyche. And sometimes the turbulence is so great that it comes out through the body as illness. So working with these hindrances is 99% of our work. 1% is insight. So there's a connection between wisdom and ethics. If you read the scriptures, the Buddha only teaches two things: ethical behavior and transcendence. Our ethical behavior is an expression of our delusion or wisdom. The more virtuous you become, the more wise you must become. So there's a direct link between the process of liberation and the process of purification. The process of the process of liberation and the process of purification. So what is it that we are supposed to be investigating? I have to be careful here, because if we do our practice in order to get psychotherapy, we will miss out on the spiritual insights. The psychotherapy happens quite naturally.
La psicoterapia avviene in maniera naturale se pratichiamo per l'insight.
This desire we're talking about is coming from delusion. It's coming from the notion of a self. It is selfish. It looks after itself. And it creates barriers between me and other people, me and nature. And it seeks to manipulate the world in order to feel happy. So when something becomes a little unpleasant, the desire is to get rid of it. And if you can't get rid of it, put your mind on something else which is pleasant. And if something is pleasant, we want to develop it, extend it, hold it, keep it. So with this desire, we are constantly in conflict with the world as it is. And life becomes that sort of sense of struggle. So don't confuse that desire with the desire which is coming from wholesome mental states. Desires that come from a sense of care or a sense of compassion. These desires are actually leading us towards a beautiful heart. So just be aware of the desire when it comes up. Give yourself enough time to recognize whether it's wholesome or unwholesome. And if you give yourself enough time and feel relaxed inside, then you can let go. You can allow something negative to just die away. If you stay with that desire until the very end, you might see the transformation. Yes, nothing is lost in the process. No energy is lost. So everything is transformed. The person whom you're very angry with, if you wait for the anger to die right away, you might just see a sense of compassion for the person arise. But you have to stay to the very end. So these are the hindrances that we have to work with. And of course it brings a certain wisdom to our lives. Then there's impermanence. Now the thing is that we are very much aware of when something begins. The mind, the self, is always looking ahead of itself. It's always looking for something new. The new holiday, the new song, the new person. Because this gives an impression of life, of movement, of energy. But we don't like to see the ending. I mean, what happened to these pop stars? You know, what happened? Did you noticed when, for instance, you were falling ill with a cold, did you notice the ending of it? No. The mind immediately goes somewhere else. All endings are little deaths, and we don't like to go there. So whenever we come to the end of something, the mind always leaps somewhere else. So bringing our attention to the ending of things puts us in touch with our mortality, and it makes us more realistic about life. But more than that, it actually draws us into a much more intimate connection with life as it is. If our minds are always thinking about what we're going to do, we're never in the present moment. And what we think might happen or what we think will happen is never sure.
E quello che pensiamo che succederà o che dovrebbe succedere non è mai sicuro.
So we have to question ourselves and ask, well, what is the purpose of my life, and draw it into the present moment. So really getting in touch with the death, even of every moment, brings us directly into the present time. And even if the present time is terrible, at least we're being realistic. And we can make wise decisions to handle that particular situation. The Buddha said the most powerful meditation is the meditation on death. Now the final characteristic is, of course, the self. The Buddha didn't say there was no self. He said it wasn't real. It's something that we produce within our own minds. And the quality of the self is control. So in the second discourse, when he talks to his 5 companions, he starts off by saying, if this body was mine, if I was this body, I could say to this body, grow some hair on your head. I tried, it didn't work. So when you actually begin to explore what you are in control of, then you realize it's not very much. And so the self tends to shrink into itself. It becomes afraid. And the other quality of a self is that it thinks it never changes, that it's always here. But we know when you fall asleep, where's the self? Now you wake up in the morning and say, me again. Or, not me again. So, oh no, not me. So, we recognize that as we wake up, and it happens with every moment, there is this sense of me. Have you had the experience of being in a friend's house, a hotel, somewhere different, and you've woken up and for a minute you don't know where you are and who you are, and then suddenly you say, it's me. That moment of not self is terrifying. So it's a case really of recognizing the limitations of what we call me. So it's 2 things, control and impermanence. So we've discussed right awareness, the image of a child's face. We've just very surfacely looked at how to deal with hindrances, and we've discussed a little bit about the 3 characteristics of existence. How we create suffering, impermanence, not self. So what I want to do is just leave you with 2 images or 2 metaphors which explain the process we're going through. It's seemingly, when we are born, for the first 4 months, all we experience is a deluge of information. We see things, we hear things, we feel things, and so on. And we can make no sense of it, except we know when something hurts and when something is pleasant. And then after 4 months, it seems that the first object comes out of this mass of information. And it's usually your mother, your carer. So now over the next 2-3 years, the child is, about 2 years I think, the child pushes the outside world outwards to create a 3D world. And in so doing becomes aware of itself as an individual. So that by the age of 3, the child knows, I am me and everybody else is not me. And the whole process is extremely complicated, and most people have a hard time doing that. But that's the process of pushing the outer world into the outside. We are so convinced of this ability that we actually believe that we are seeing people as they are, the world as it is out there. But the process is happening all the time. My mind is constantly receiving information and placing it out there in a world which the mind is creating. What we are doing now is pushing the inner world out. We're making the inner world as objective as the outer world. And that which is pushing it out is the very intuitive awareness that is doing the investigation. And as it pushes, as the baby pushed the world out to recognize itself as an individual, so we're pushing out the inner world to discover our true nature. And that is the Buddha within. So this is the first metaphor. The second one is to do with Narcissus. So Narcissus was a beautiful young man. And as he looked into the pond and saw himself, he fell in love. Now usually the myth is seen as an expression of self-love, of narcissistic behavior. We say narcissist. But from a spiritual point of view, this Narcissus has seen an image of himself in the water. He presumes that this image is his real self. And therefore he goes to embrace it. And he falls into the water, the pond. He drowns into the pond. In mythology, water is always creative. So this is what's happening to us all the time until we become fully liberated. The awareness catches its awareness of itself on the screen of consciousness. And this consciousness is flashing all the time. And with every flash, it is showing a certain sense base. So the awareness sees itself, and then it sees the world. It sees itself, and then it hears the world. It sees itself, and it tastes the world. And is so entranced it falls into the world of the mind. And this is the process of delusion. And the problem with delusion is that you don't know you're deluded. This is the definition of delusion. So our process is to go back on that process and just see how we are creating the world. And it might be that sometime, especially for those who are here for the week, a great silence and a peace descends upon you. And there is a very clear sense of the observer, the feeler, the one who knows. And if for just a moment you look back into the observer and then ask yourself, what is it made of? What was inside? And here we understand this word emptiness. Nibbana is empty. It's empty of the psychophysical world. And according to the Buddha, this is the highest happiness. And so there is a renunciation of the world of pleasure as a place to seek happiness. And of course the Buddha in his enlightenment, the Buddha as a liberated person was living in a world of unliberated people. He had no problem with that. So that's where we're heading. It's not too bad, huh? I can only hope my words have been of some assistance, that I have not caused even greater confusion, and that by your constant effort you will liberate yourself from all suffering, sooner rather than later.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Very good.